All right, so I wanted to tell you tonight about some of the work that we've been doing in our community, but also about some of the new science regarding resiliency and how you can build it in children. I'd like to also mention that we've enjoyed a variety of different kinds of funding from the Palix Foundation, from Alberta Innovates Health Solutions, the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, as well as the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. University of Lethbridge has supported us, as has my home department at the University of Lethbridge Department of Neuroscience. So I was going to show you a video, but as Wendy mentioned, we just tried this and it didn't work very well. So you can watch this on your own in the PowerPoint that she's sharing with you. It's a little video. It's only about 4 minutes long, but it covers the main features of developing a brain and how to keep it healthy. So although it is aimed at little people in the preschool years, that is the exact same things that they talk about on how to build a healthy brain in childhood actually work for adolescents, they work for young adults, and it works for seniors. So I do tend to use this video in all kinds of presentations I give because it's a good foundation to remind us about the nature of the brain and how we can keep it healthy. So if we had an opportunity to see that video, it would talk about building a healthy brain. And it really covers some of the main facets of the pieces that go together to keep that brain as you're building it healthy and keep it healthy throughout the lifespan. And it really all starts with a strong foundation. And that, it turns out, is developed by having lots of positive experiences early in life. We also have to have protection from toxic stress. And so children, if you don't know what toxic stress is, it's very difficult to protect children from it. So we'll be talking about that as this presentation continues. But if we know what it is, then we can step in and make sure that we try to protect our littlest people from experiencing those stressors. We also need to develop strong air traffic control skills, which is it's the air traffic control that helps a young child keep track of all of the activities that are going on around us. It turns out that air traffic control or executive function is one of the key attributes that you can help build, and it is one of the key protective factors for stress, so building resilience. And then we will also talk about the nature of positive nurturing relationships and that serve and return and how important it is for the brain in childhood, again in adolescence, and in young adulthood and seniors as well. So all of this information comes from Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, and this initiative has been around for some time now. The video that I wanted to show you, the Brain Builders video, is available there. And if you find the content useful, you are encouraged to download it and share it with others. It's a wonderful way to keep the conversation alive regarding the importance of this information and keeping our brains healthy, particularly in times of stress, such as we are all experiencing right now. I'd also encourage you to have a look at the Brain Story Certification course. You can enroll at Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, and it takes about 20 to 30 hours of time. There's 19 modules that are self-paced, and you can do a little bit or a lot at any given time. And when you're all done, you get a certificate of completion. I also wanted to tell you that of late, many Alberta companies, organizations, school divisions are asking for people to have this as a basic understanding of how the brain works. And I think it is a lovely opportunity as it is offered for free. Just another little shout out. We have also developed a Brain Architect Level 1 course, and we being some of the people I work with here in Lethbridge. And this is a course that takes about an hour to complete. It really is a refresher on some of the key important pieces of information regarding childhood brain development. And it's aimed at helping build confidence in parents that they understand what's going on in their children and how to introduce interactions, how to have engaged interactions with their children so they can build those sturdy foundations. So this little course is available on our Building Brains Together website, and you can sign up there for the course. As I said, it's 1 hour, it's totally free, and you also get a certificate when you complete it. So I think it's important to understand why it is those early experiences and our later experiences have such a profound effect on our brain. And it's fair to say that for the longest time, we hadn't appreciated just how much experience was contributing to the way our brains were developing and wiring up and how they react to later experiences. We now know that our experiences have the power to turn genes on in our DNA and also turn them off. And so when you have a gene being turned on, you can consider it being endorsed by your experience, and then you're able to make the protein that that particular gene codes for. If it has been turned off by your experience, you are unable to make that protein, and that is why we call experience the signature effect for epigenetics. So here we see a chromosome, and you can see the DNA that's wrapped around all of these little histones. And then here's the DNA in its double-stranded state. And you can see on some of these nucleotide pairs, a methyl group is attached. Now that is one of the means by which environment can leave a mark. So it can put a methyl group on, or it can take it off. And when the methyl group is sitting on a promoter site, you cannot make the protein that that particular gene encodes for. So this is a close-up of how that works. Let's say this is a gene shown here, and here's the promoter site. We have RNA polymerase as a little enzyme that comes and sits in the promoter site, and it initiates the process of reading the information on this DNA so you can make messenger RNA, which will go off and eventually make a protein. When there is a methyl block on the promoter site, the RNA polymerase cannot sit in the promoter site, and so it cannot take the action of producing the protein that that particular gene encodes for. So when we think about how epigenetics influences our brain and our behavior and how we develop, we can think of it as nature on one side and nurture on the other. So nature are the genes that we inherit from our parents, both our mother and our father, and they do have an influence on our physical appearance and our personality and other various characteristics. On the other hand, we have nurture, and this is the foods that we eat, the experiences that we have, and the environment that we find ourselves in. These two elements work together in the science of epigenetics to alter our gene function and influence various neurobiological pathways, including our physical health, our mental health, how we behave, and how we learn and understand things. So I want to get in now to what is stress, because as I've just told you, experiences can change your genome by epigenetic means and alter how your genes are expressed. So when we're talking about stress, it actually has a key influence on how those proteins are either produced or shut down in production based on these stressful experiences that one can have. So stress is our body's reaction to a change, and it usually requires some kind of an adjustment. It can be a physical adjustment, it can be a mental adjustment, or even an emotional adjustment to whatever situation that we find ourselves in. And it can be caused by both good and bad experiences. So two types of stress, you can consider positive stress as eustress and negative stress as distress or toxic stress. So positive stress is caused by good experiences. And the reason we have a stress system in the first place is to help us problem solve, understand what's going on in our situation, come up with a reasonable solution, and find a path forward so we can be successful. When we have this good kind of stress, it increases our performance, both physically and mentally. It puts you on your game, so to speak. So you put in your very best performance with activation of the stress system in this regard. But when you have overactivation of the stress system, traumatic stress or ongoing chronic stress, that can turn into a toxic stressor. And it is considered, both of them, forms of distress. So these are negative stresses caused by bad experiences, and they decrease our performance, both physically and mentally. So this is how stress works in our lives. We want to be on the optimal part of this curve. So in a medium level of stress, that tends to be when humans do their very best. When we don't have enough stress in our lives, we may be asleep, or we may be having a hard time staying alert to our environment. And if we have too much stress, we tend to experience things like anxiety and eventually disorganization. And if it goes on for long periods of time, it can lead to depression. So here we have the performance on this side, and you can see low performance when you're sleeping, low performance when you're feeling disorganized or depressed. So I want to also couch the terms of eustress and distress as positive, tolerable, and toxic stress. So positive stress is that eustress, and it usually causes just a brief increase in heart rate. You get mild elevation in stress hormones, and that actually helps you focus in on the problem at hand. It helps you put you at your very best mentally and physically. As I've mentioned, when we have toxic stress, it can be from chronic stress or it can be from traumatic stress, and it causes a prolonged activation of the stress system. And if you do not have a protective relationship, and here's where relationships play a huge role, you will experience this stress as a toxic stressor. And this is particularly true of children who do not have an attached adult helping them find their way through the stressful situation that they're experiencing. But if a child is experiencing toxic stress and they do have an adult, an alpha attachment relationship in their lives, it changes that toxic stress to still serious stress, but it is buffered by that supportive relationship. So it can change a toxic stress into a tolerable stress. And I want to give an example, and this may seem a little bit extreme, but imagine, for instance, a child at home by themselves and a tornado is coming and it's causing damage around. Well, this child has no adult to turn to help them understand the situation, how best to keep themselves safe. And in that situation, the tornado would be a toxic stressor to that little person. But if their parent was there or a grandparent was there and helped them understand what was going on and where they would be best moved to so they could be safe, and assuring them that they were going to be there with them through this whole experience, then what was a toxic stress can become a tolerable stress. When you can move stress down to this level, it doesn't have the devastating consequences on our mental and physical health as toxic stress does. So it turns out the kinds of experiences that we've had as little people actually alter the way our stress system works. So if you've had positive or tolerable stress as a child, when you get into adulthood, your stress reactivity is more or less already set. And I don't mean it's set in stone, but it has a set point based on our previous experiences. So if your stresses have been positive or tolerable, when you get into adulthood, you actually have just a modest stress reactivity in a stressful situation. And as a result of the way you respond to stress, you have a reduced risk for disease. But if as a small person you were suffering a lot of toxic stress, that toxic stress can increase the reactivity of your stress system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And when that stress system gets primed, when you get older and you find yourself in a stressful situation, it increases your stress reactivity. So you get stress hormones being pumped out for prolonged periods of time, and that has damaging effects on both your body and your brain. It can increase a person's risk for heart disease in their middle-aged years, for type 2 diabetes, for things like substance abuse, including alcoholism or drug use. Affective disorders can come into play where you have a hard time managing your mood, like depression. even bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and then ultimately early dementia, because stress has such a negative consequence on our physiology if those levels stay too high for too long. So that's what this slide actually illustrates. In cases where we have prolonged stress, we know that hippocampal neurons in our brain, and the hippocampus is a very important place in the brain as it helps us learn and remember new information. It is also key in our spatial navigation, but those neurons contain receptors that will feedback and shut off our stress response when the stress levels get too high. But when you have prolonged stress and you have lots of cortisol being secreted, it kills the neurons that can actually shut down cortisol secretion. And so you end up in this vicious cycle of producing too much cortisol, and that's causing damage to your hippocampal neurons. With fewer hippocampal neurons, again, you have a decreased ability to shut off that cortisol. So an important thing to understand is we can rebuild those hippocampal neurons. It's not set in stone. Once they're gone, they're not gone forever necessarily. But with exercise or using drugs like fluoxetine, it does appear that you can regain your hippocampal neurons. So what typically happens when people have this going on is they end up in a major depression. And then you have to try to encourage them to get moving in order to build some new neurons. So exercise will help, as I said. But also, if they are given medication, they have to stay on it for a few weeks in order to start to enjoy the benefits of rebuilding those hippocampal neurons. Now, some years ago, Vince Felletti and his came to Lethbridge, and he told us about his work, and he called his study "Turning Gold into Lead." And at that point, I thought it was quite a clever turn of phrase, because he was implying that all children are built with the potential to be golden, but if enough awful things happen to them, they can turn out with an outcome that's more like lead. So he described what he had been doing in California, and his work was called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, or the ACE study. Now, Vince worked with 17,000 middle-aged adults in California, actually in the San Diego area, and he noticed that a lot of people were coming in with complaints in their middle years when they should be healthy and enjoying life, and they were suffering from all kinds of complaints: obesity, struggling with their mental health, struggling with their weight or heart disease. And he was curious to know if there was any link to their previous experiences as to why they were suffering from all of these health issues later in life. So he sent them home with a survey, and this was a survey to look at their experiences from birth until 18 years of age. And when he got back the surveys, he was stunned to see how many people said they had adverse childhood experiences. And they did some study on this and looked at the statistics, and what they discovered was the more adverse childhood experiences one of the clients that he was looking at may have suffered was correlated with their health status. So two key things is that they're more common, and they do have an effect on mental and physical health later in life. And one of the key areas that suffers is the frontal lobe. It's particularly sensitive to our experiences, and we suffer a great deal of stress. It actually impairs our frontal lobe's function. So what were the adverse experiences that they asked about? There were really three categories of adverse experiences. The first category was abuse. Were you ever physically abused in your family? Were you ever emotionally abused in your family? Or did you ever suffer sexual abuse from someone in your family or someone outside your family as a young person? Did you ever feel that you suffered from neglect, physical neglect or emotional neglect? Was there any household dysfunction, mental illness in either of your parents? Did you have an incarcerated relative, close relative living in the home? Did you ever witness your mother treated violently? Was there substance abuse in the home, including alcohol? Or did your parents divorce or separate Or was there a death of one of your parents? So all of those things constituted this little survey. And there were 10 questions that were asked. And then people responded to those questions. And when the data came in, they found that only 33% of the population reported 0 as an ACE score. So none of those things happened to them. 26% of the population said they had 1. 16% said they had 2, and it bumps back up to 25 or more for 3 or more of those adverse childhood experiences. So that's a hefty dose for some children to have experienced. This was redone in Alberta a few years ago around Calgary, in sort of the High River Calgary area, and it was done by phone. And because there's not that many incarcerated Albertans, they didn't ask that question. So they actually only asked 8 of the 10 questions. And what they discovered was Albertans reported having a 44% having a 0 score. But remember, this is only 8 questions. And 27% had 1, 8% had 2, and 3 or more were 20%. So we're back up into this range over 28, 30%, 2 or more. And so quite a hefty number of Albertans having the same kinds of stress dose, so to speak, as children. So what we learned from that study is there's a strong association between the number of ACEs and poor health outcomes. And that strong association remained there even when other risk factors for poor health outcomes were taken into consideration, such as socioeconomic status, IQ, level of education, and so on and so forth. So almost 50% of the risk for poor adult health outcomes seemed to be attributable to ACEs. We know that adverse childhood experiences have an impact on education as well. So students who have 3 or more ACEs are 2.5 times more likely to fail a grade. They score lower on standardized tests, and they have more difficulties expressing themselves and more difficulty understanding language. They're also suspended or expelled more often from school, considered disruptive to the classroom, and are quite often designated to special education classrooms. They tend also to have poor health, even in that early period of life. So if you consider adverse childhood experiences, they really are the major preventable pathway for this mental illness, the physical health problems, and even substance abuse later on. So we can consider this something that we can take action on. And it really lays at the crossroads of public health. It's going to make a difference for a society if people are protected from adverse childhood experiences in their early lives. They can move forward with healthier outcomes as they get older. So we do know that this is a self-fulfilling cycle again. When you have early trauma and stress, you get certain patterns of brain development that are different than if you haven't had those exposures, and it shows up as slowed language acquisition, maybe problems with reading, less lateralization of the brain. Our brains are lateralized to help us specialize with language on the left, typically, and spatial understanding on the right, typically. And children who have had a lot of adverse childhood experiences, who have suffered a lot of stress early in life, do not show that same lateralization. They tend to have lower IQs, and because their frontal lobe has been severely affected by the stress, they have poor decision-making skills. They have more memory problems, and that is associated with the hippocampus and losing those neurons that help with controlling the stress. They show more attention problems in school. They have more diagnoses of attention deficit disorder and more diagnoses of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They tend to not understand social cues well, and as a result of that, they engage in more aggressive behavior. They don't have a lot of friends, so they're more isolated, and they really have problems understanding situations that they find themselves in, and they tend to act out in inappropriate ways. So after all that is laid down in the earliest years of education, then they have a significant risk of use and abuse of alcohol and drugs in their early teenage years. They have more problems with school failure and being assigned to special education. More of these students drop out. So there's more suspensions and expulsions, more delinquency, and then they start on the prison pipeline. And for you, those of you that are not aware, in the US, they monitor the number of children entering kindergarten in any given year, and they build their prisons according to that number because they know what the percentage of people who typically end up in justice as a result of having some failure in the social system. So they actually build their jails based on population figures of how many kindergarten children are in the system. In adulthood, these children start showing a risk for their children. They have low-paying jobs. They tend to have to work more than one to just put enough food on the table for their family, or they may be unemployed or on public assistance. They could be in prison, and they have chronic health problems, so they miss a lot of work, or they may be let go from their jobs because they have health issues that makes them unable to attend work all the time. And then add into that mental health and addiction problems. Sorry, my mouse is sensitive and it moves the slides around. So we also know that that isn't the only kind of stress in our society. There's a whole context of stress that really focuses on families and the family unit and how things may have gone wrong for children and how they need to be protected. But we have to also be aware that there are things such as intergenerational trauma, and that is trauma that has happened in generations before, and then the children and the grandchildren have epigenetic changes on their genome, and as a result of that, they have alterations in their metabolic activity. They may have more problems with stress or health as a result of things that may have happened to their parents, grandparents, even great-grandparents, and historically. And then there is historical trauma. Think of the residential schools and how that has had a huge impact on our First Nations, our Indigenous people. We can also talk about race-based or insidious trauma. We're talking a lot about racism these days, and the US is really struggling with this. Not to say Canada doesn't have a lot of those very same issues. And insidious trauma is not recognizing that lack of consideration, that marginalization of people who are part of our society. So historical factors can interact with our current day stressors, and that can result in problematic outcomes for people. It can be individuals or families or even communities. So when you think about adding pandemic stress into all of this, there's a huge stress context that we're struggling with these days. So at this point, I'd like to direct you to Alberta Health Services, and they have trauma-informed care modules. They have a project that has been going on for some time now, and they offer these modules, again, for free, and you can take whichever ones interest you. So you can sign up. I think there is a website there, but I guess it's linked to the website. And if you just click on it, it will take you to what is trauma-informed care. Now, I've done all of these modules. I encourage my students at university to do these modules. I do believe that all of us have to be more sensitive to people who have experienced trauma. And starting with what is trauma-informed care, just opening up or changing your perspective about why people behave the way they do. The second module is on trauma, and then it covers disaster response. That's clearly important for people who are in the medical profession or disaster service relief. Loss and grief after trauma, I think, is also a very important module. And one I think anyone who is in human services should look at is trauma in human service workers. And this module really talks a lot about self-care. The final module is on emotional literacy, and it makes the point that anyone can learn better emotional literacy at any point in their lives. Now, this little last module is built like a game based on Alice in Wonderland book, and even children who are in middle school, this is an entirely appropriate module to have them have a look at. So I would encourage you to have a look at those, and you get a certificate after each one of those that you complete. So if you're trauma informed, it really changes the narrative. It's no longer, what is wrong with you? Why do you behave like that? To, I wonder what's happened to you to cause you to feel this way and engage in that kind of behavior. It really is a different narrative. We also have to shift our notions about stress. When people believe stress will hurt them, it tends to have more of a negative effect on their physical and mental health than if you understand that we have stress to help us. Our stress helps us solve problems. As I told you, when it's in modest quantities, it's actually helping you to be on top of your game. And when you can accept that you cannot prevent stress, you can look at it as an opportunity to grow. You can also seek to understand a child's stress, a child who may be experiencing stress in your environment, and rather than brush it off or try and dismiss it, really try to seek to understand it. Have those engaged conversations with the child, those open-ended questions to try to help understand what it is they're experiencing, and never try to minimalize it. It's important that they're heard, and it's important that they understand that you care. We also need to explain to our children that stress can be good and you can learn from it, as I've just told you. And then help your child find those areas of growth because of the stressors that they're finding in their lives. And again, although the pandemic has been really hard for us all, it does offer some opportunity to understand stress a little bit better. So we do know that resiliency does appear in individuals, and these individuals tend to have a fairly high early childhood IQ. Children who have a higher executive function scores are also more resilient than children that do not. And a high reading score in first grade seems to also be correlated with this resiliency. The number of friends you have is related to your resiliency. And if when you have stress or you've had a trauma, you go to counseling or cognitive behavioral therapy, it makes a difference for your resiliency. It is important to have that strong, nurturing, positive relationship in your life with an appropriate alpha adult. It can be a parent, it can be a grandparent, an auntie, an uncle, it can be a teacher. But that attachment needs to happen in order for our little people to have that nurturing relationship that can help them buffer their toxic stress and make it tolerable. And then the trauma-informed care piece. The more we understand about trauma and the more we develop our emotional literacy, the more empathic we become, and understanding other individuals and trying to see the world through the lens that they see it through. And it really is important when we run into individuals who have experienced trauma to respond with compassion and care. So you have to remember that everyone has a context. So when children are acting out or having behaviors that are hard to manage, it's probably not those children in and of themselves that need support. Likely the parents, the family need support, caregivers, all of those people need support, and they need to understand how they can best accomplish that support for their child. So we do know there is a whole group in North America that has been devoted to understanding the protective factors to strengthen families. And I recently had an opportunity to take a workshop on this. And they really make a case that if these elements are in place in a family, children do better. So the whole family does better, the children in the family do better. And one of the first things is parental knowledge of brain development. The second thing is having lots of friends, lots of connection for the parents and the children, and having parent flexibility. This is well-developed executive function skills, and that requires working at building necessary skills in the prefrontal cortex, and then showing your ability to self-regulate, that emotional regulation, understanding how to manage your emotions, how to develop that emotional literacy. When families understand how to access supports like counseling, housing, food if they need it, or social supports, their families do better because that support is in place to help buffer the stress the family's experiencing and help the child develop in more beneficial ways for their later lives. And we can foster building executive function and self-regulation in children. So those are 5 key factors that we can use to strengthen our families. So we do know that success requires that you have these 3 domains of executive function under control. One of them is working memory, another is inhibitory control, and the third category is cognitive flexibility. Now, the interesting thing about executive function is you can start to work on it from the time a child is a baby, and you can continue to work and build on it in the preschool years and later in life. Second period for building strong executive functions happens to be the adolescent period. But you can see if we just look at the working memory column, by 7 to 9 months, children are developing an ability to remember an unseen object is still there. Just because they can't see it doesn't mean it's disappeared. And they look to putting these actions together, like hiding a favorite toy with a blanket and then pulling the blanket away and the surprise of seeing the toy there. So there are elements that you can work on throughout the school years, and we do have a website. That website that I encourage you to go to for the Brain Architect Level 1 course is called buildingbrains.ca, and on our website we have a variety of games that you can play with children. So we do encourage everyone to spend time with their children building these skills, and much of it can be done in playful encounters with your children. So as I mentioned, the early years are a wonderful time to build skills as far as executive function goes, but another period of life where we're really good at building these skills is between the ages of about 12 and 25. Now, if you're highly motivated as an adult, you can continue to build these skills throughout your lifespan. But there are 2 natural periods when our brain is open to making adjustments and improving our executive function skills, and that is in the preschool years and again in adolescence. So there have been a variety of ways that have been published on how you can improve executive function, and play is one of the key elements here. When you play with your children, they get into that blissful state. It opens their minds for learning. And when you do it in intentional ways, you can build all kinds of executive function skills in them. We also know aerobic exercise with some sort of instruction can help build executive function. Having children play sports that are team sports tends to build executive function. And engaging in things like mindfulness practices. It reduces our stress level, it helps us become more body aware, and in doing so, it helps build our executive function. Activities like martial arts, the traditional kinds, the taekwondo, yoga, those both incorporate mindfulness practice, and they are effective at building executive function. Musical training, it turns out, and this is work that we recently did with a graduate student who went into the middle schools in Lethbridge and did some work on understanding who had musical training and then testing adolescents and their executive function. And it turns out that children who have musical training, even from the earliest years of life, show better self-regulation and behavioral inhibition in adult or adolescents than do children who have not had that musical training. And then there's a variety of classroom curricula that you could look into, and we offer a set of games on our website that we do encourage people to try with their children at home. And we also spend a great deal of our time educating early childhood educators and caregivers on how you can play these games with children and how it can make a difference in their executive function. So this is one of the games that we play. This is called the Dimensional Change Card Sort. And in this card deck, and this was an adaptation of a game that Phil Zalazzo and his colleagues came up with, you have bunnies and boats in a deck of cards. And you can have blue bunnies and red bunnies, blue boats and red boats. And then you sort the deck according to color or according to shape. That turns out not to be easy for a 3-year-old. They'll tend to see one obvious way to sort, and it's harder for them to detect that there is a second way to sort. So with a little bit of work, you can get them to understand that life is like this. You can see it from more than one perspective. We also know that imaginative play builds executive function in spades. So this kind of play is building language skills, it's building empathy, it's building communication skills, and it's allowing creativity and imagination, the likes of which we typically do not see in children. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing here in the Lethbridge community, and we have been focused on preschool children between the ages of 3 and 5. This is a classroom at one of the schools that we've been working in. And again, this video doesn't work very well when I play it online. And this person here is Lynn Watrickish, who is the early education manager at Westminster School, where we piloted our work some years ago now, and she continues to use the program in her daily offerings with her children. Lynn has just recently received a Prime Minister's Award for Early Childhood Education, and we're so very proud of her. And she credits the award and the work that she's currently doing with children in understanding executive function, understanding how games can build these skills in little people, and adapting the lessons from the games into all kinds of activities that she does in the classroom. Oh. One thing we do know is that when we play games with little people, we are building relationship with those little people. And when we build relationship, there's release of a hormone called oxytocin. It's the bonding hormone or the love hormone. And a child who shows more resiliency, it can be because they have more release of oxytocin, and it promotes this resiliency. It also reduces stress levels in the children who have that nurturing relationship. A little tap or a pat on the head or a smile or a hug can actually be enough to start releasing oxytocin and developing a stronger relationship with that adult. And humans are social beings, and we thrive on relationships, not just as little people, but throughout our lifespan. So oxytocin is buffering our stress, and it is present in higher levels when we're with an attached adult. So this helps us understand how we can move a toxic stressor into that tolerable stress range. It's also keenly involved in brain plasticity, and it allows individuals to overcome adversity because of those relationships that they're experiencing. So pandemic is really hard to deal with, and when you top that on that we're social beings and we've been isolated, it really makes things quite difficult. So do you keep yourself safe at home with your children, or do you risk exposure to the virus? What's clear is no matter which direction you choose, you have to continue to build resilience through relationships. And that's not impossible, although much harder if you're using a screen and using a function like Zoom that we're using here tonight. So resilience, what is it? It really requires relationships. It's not self-determination. It's not how much effort you're putting in to pick yourself up by the bootstraps and move on with it. These are capabilities that can be strengthened at any age, so we can learn to be more resilient in our response. But it's important to understand that resilience is a state, it's not a trait. So we can build resilience, but how we react to any given experience that we're having can be different from one to the next. So you may be able to show resiliency following one adversity and break down entirely as your response to another. So a person can show resiliency, but it doesn't mean it's the be all and end all and they will always be fine on the other end. What it does mean, though, is sometimes it requires a little bit more work with those relationships to support a person under certain conditions. So again, the number one need to keep that brain healthy and working well, building the important sturdy foundation in childhood and continue the healthy development of the brain throughout the life is this need for ongoing nurturing relationship. So Dr. Gordon Neufeld is an expert in relationship and attachment, and he puts forth this notion that we can start building relationship in fairly simple ways. We can try to catch a child's eyes, and he calls that collecting their eyes. So you look at them until you see them looking back at you. And when you see that you've made the connection, you smile at them. And then you give them a little nod. And so all of these things is telling the child that you're happy that they're there, you're in a positive relationship with them. If you're near the child, you can give them a light touch on the arm, or you can talk in a very loving, gentle way to them, speaking slowly and showing that compassion and care through your voice. So showing the child that you see them as significant and a sign that they're loved. We also know that just the smiling piece is huge, and this is research that has been done by Dr. Ron Gutman. And Dr. Goodman has looked for years and years at how smiling has an impact on our health and our mental health. And he has determined that when you engage in a big smile, as he is in his picture, it actually reduces your blood pressure. It increases the production of natural endorphins in your body, and it reduces your stress hormones. So not just the cortisol, it can also reduce adrenaline. And it turns out that our ability to laugh in a very mirthful way in a situation is also very helpful for our brain health. Laughter, mirthful laughter, and Wendy has kindly put in a definition here. It's providing mirth, it's amusing, it's joyous, it's cheerful, it's jolly, it's merry. It turns out that it works just as well as meditation in promoting wellness. So I told you that meditation and mindfulness is one way that you can develop executive function. Well, here's another way, making sure you take a moment to have a laugh when there's a funny situation. Of course, never making fun of others, but taking into account that nobody loves a good laugh and an unexpected outcome than humans do. So you can actually hear laughter in a variety of species, including chimpanzees and even rats. It turns out that if you tickle a rat, they laugh, and you can pick it up in ultrasonic waves. So laughter has a powerful effect on brain development, and it also works to reduce our stress. It could be an underutilized means of promoting wellness. So we'll come back to how our brains work. If we think of the green side as using our executive functions and managing, problem solving, working memory, behavioral inhibition, and the red side being our autonomic nervous system, particularly the fight or flight system, when we find ourselves in a situation, we tend to react rather quickly and sometimes even unconsciously to the situation. And that is managed by our amygdala in our brain, and the amygdala feeds into our autonomic nervous system. So if it perceives danger, your heart starts to race and you start to feel that adrenaline rush that's changing your physiology, getting you prepared for the stress. But if you take a moment and engage your frontal cortex and look at these executive functions and how they can help you problem solve, it actually can change something that's a reactive situation into a proactive situation. Our executive function skills can inhibit those automatic responses, and they really help us think things through so we can achieve our life goals. So it is important to always have, of course, an automatic system, but it's equally important to be able to put the brakes on that system when you need to engage in a different strategy to be successful. So we have an automatic strategy on one side and an intentional strategy on the other. And the intentional strategy is helping us achieve our important goals and life successes. So as a child, if you have too many of those adverse childhood experiences, you get an hyper-developed automatic system and an underdeveloped executive function system. And as a result of that, when you get into adulthood, your overdeveloped automatic system is still in control. So you tend to have an overblown stress response when you find yourself in a stressful situation, and it is harder for you to bring to mind the kinds of problem-solving skills that could help you resolve the situation and reduce your stress levels. So the severe frequent stress will redirect the brain development in a child to be more sensitive to stress later on. This leaves them really in the automatic domain rather than in the executive function domain. And this can cause problems with their academic life, and it can cause problems with their later life and their relationships. So another thing, as we're talking about relationships, teenagers come to mind because they're really changing their relationships as their brain is being rewired from the childhood behaviors that help them be successful as children. And they're changing their wiring so they can engage in adult behaviors that will help them be more successful in adulthood. So it turns out that this is a time when people start to feel a real need to contribute. So they have this wonderful intellect, and they start to notice that there are problems in our society around them. And often they perceive that they could make a difference. And so when we can welcome that need for belonging by contributing to society, it helps them develop their self-worth, and it empowers them. And those are skills that help them to develop better executive function. So they have a better ability to perceive what's going on around them. They start to see things in a more empathic way. They see other individuals and the struggles that they're having. And when they want to make a difference, this enhanced social understanding can help them take a role in more pro-social behaviors and help them resolve complex situations. So all of this can be achieved by supporting these young people, helping them access materials that would help them with their ideas on how they can make a difference, encouraging them even to contribute to their families with chores, sometimes working outside the home and making a small monetary contribution to the family can also make them feel more valued, being a more important part of the family. And equally at school or within the community, there are youth advisory councils that students can get involved in. And all of these things help them understand that they have the ability to change the world, and that makes them feel terrific, and it builds their executive function skills at the same time. Now, way back in the 50s, Dr. Hans Selye started studying stress, and he's a Canadian researcher from the Montreal area, and he was studying how stress makes a difference in the behavior in the brains of animals. And after he'd studied stress for some period of time, he came up with this quote, "Every stress leaves an indelible scar, and the organism pays for its survival after a stressful situation by becoming a little older." Just recently, we've learned more about how stress is stored in our body through the epigenetic changes that it wrought in our DNA. And so the memories of those experiences are stored in our body, even if we don't remember the events ourselves. So a little person like this little baby can experience a trauma, perhaps witness some domestic violence, and never remember the event, but still show the marks on their DNA that shows that that stress has affected them. And it can have consequences for their mental and physical health later on. So it turns out that we have on our chromosomes these telomeres right on the end. And the length of the telomeres in the chromosomes determines how many times a cell can divide in a healthy situation. So they protect the ends of our chromosomes, and as they naturally shorten as we get older. But toxic stress accelerates the shortening of the telomeres. And interestingly enough, if you build healthy, nurturing relationships, it reverses that telomere degradation, and you can restore the length of your telomeres by having access to those healthy, nurturing relationships. A few years ago, I had the pleasure, I'm a sort of TED Talk addict, and I like to watch them when I'm exercising. And I came across Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn's talk on the puzzle of aging, and she really gets into this notion of telomeres. She was originally studying pond scum, but she starts applying some of her knowledge to human relationships, and she comes up with this notion that we really need to invest in our nurturing, healthy relationships in order to keep our cells and our chromosomes as healthy as possible. So it turns out if you go to this diagram in your website, you can actually, it's an interactive diagram, and it helps you reinforce the concepts that we've been talking about. But there are 3 principles to engage with to improve outcomes for children and their families. The number one, I would say, and always for me, the number one on anything to do with keeping a brain developing properly and healthy is supportive, responsive relationships. The second thing is reducing those sources of stress and protecting from toxic stress. If an adult has experienced toxic stress, they should go to counseling because they need to be there for their children when their children are expressing stress. And if you're consumed by your own stress, it's really difficult to be effective in helping your children manage theirs. And then developing those core life skills that involve executive function, working memory, cognitive flexibility, and behavioral inhibition. So it turns also out that if children have access to these three core principles, they will have healthy development and better educational achievement. If adults have access to this, they have better caregiving, they're better parents, and they have more economic stability in the family. So clearly, it's something that we all need to recognize as being an important feature of developing through the lifespan. Now, I have a little video I wanted to show you, and this also comes from the Harvard Center of the Developing Child. And this center has been a key in helping us hone our skills and produce the program that we're using here in Lethbridge. Oops.
Building core capabilities for life. Every day we take on the ordinary, sometimes challenging tasks of work, school, parenting, relationships, and just managing our busy lives. How do we navigate these tasks successfully? And what can send us off course? Science offers an explanation. We all need a set of core capabilities that we can develop with practice over time. Scientists call them executive function or self-regulation skills, and they help us to focus on what's important, to plan ahead, set goals, and meet them. They help us deal with whatever life throws at us and still keep heading where we need to go. They help us resist impulsive behaviors.
Stop.
And change course when we need to. No one is born with executive function skills, but everyone can build them. We build them through a lifetime of making connections within and among the regions of the brain. Our brains begin life with billions of neurons, rapidly connecting to each other as we experience the world around us, making trillions of connections in just a few years. Early simple circuits form a foundation that more complex circuits and skills build on as we grow and have new experiences. These complex circuits, built throughout childhood and reaching across vast regions of the brain, make our core capabilities possible. The more we use these connections, the stronger and faster they become. That's why practice is so important. When we are children, we practice these skills by playing games, learning teamwork, adjusting to new rules. We continue to develop these skills in adolescence by managing school and other things like work, sports, music, and relationships. When we practice executive function skills, circuits rapidly connect the prefrontal cortex to other parts of the brain. These circuits act like an air traffic control system in the brain. They manage incoming information and help us respond with intention, not on impulse. Threatening or stressful experiences activate different circuits, and those trigger automatic responses: fight, flight, or freeze. We need automatic responses for survival, but if stress is constant, these automatic fight or flight circuits become stronger and faster than our more productive intentional circuits, the ones we use for executive function and self-regulation. For anyone under stress, it's hard to call on intentional skills. If we've been experiencing serious stress from our earliest years, the stress caused by poverty, violence, or addiction, a chaotic environment, it's even harder. Under lots of stress every day, it's harder still. The key is counterbalancing those automatic responses by building up our intentional ones, by building strong executive function skills. The good news is these core capabilities can be strengthened. How? By redesigning our systems so they reduce the sources of stress in people's lives, by simplifying how services are provided to families, helping them meet basic needs and building on strengths. Because small successes lead to bigger ones. With less stress, we can practice the skills we already have and build new circuits for the intentional responses we need. Stronger brain circuits are built through practice in situations that matter. That's true for children, it's true for adolescents, and it's true for adults. Helping children build skills gives them a strong foundation for all that comes later. Helping teens build their skills propels them into greater success as adults and parents. And helping adult caregivers build their core capabilities ensures success at work, stable homes, and responsive relationships for the next generation. When our communities work together to help children and adults build these skills, we create a positive cycle as one generation passes them on to the next. And that helps us all.
Okay, so that is the presentation I had for you tonight.
All right, we've got a lot of questions here. Can you hear me, Robin? Robin, can you hear? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, I can hear you,
Okay,
yes.
yeah, we've got quite a few questions here. Do you feel that children's ability to bounce back has reached a breaking point?
I actually think because of our brain plasticity and the remarkable abilities of our brain to overcome adversity, I don't think it is at a breaking point, but we have to be sensitive that things that would not typically be a trigger for stress are now becoming triggers for stressors. But again, if you look at the individual as not fairly well-developed executive function skills, I mean, I can always do better, but clearly, if I'm suffering from this kind of an exposure, I can imagine what children are feeling. And I have two grandchildren who do their online schooling here in my home. And honestly, first of all, I think all of the teachers who are doing online education deserve some kind of a pay raise that's enormous, because the technical difficulties, the problems that they face every day with the little people, and those are real stressors for little people who don't have the paper that the teacher's talking about and can't find it amongst all the papers they have available to them, or do not know what she's talking about because she's not there to help guide them to the right resource. So there's huge stress on both ends. And that's why I think those little physical activity breaks should really be spent with playtime for the children to help them de-stress and get them in a better space before they move back to the online schooling. But I'm so looking forward to, as I'm sure all of you, for this to end, because I'm concerned a bit about how students are not playing with their friends. And that's one of the best ways they de-stress in a school situation. And when you're at home with grandma, it still can be play, but it's not the same. And they're craving it. They're craving that contact. So I do think that we need to try to be safe with our children, but also try to be flexible enough that allows them or affords them some opportunity to engage in play. And sometimes it's online, but they're keeping in contact with their friends.
Right. Are there questions I can ask my little one, 6 years old, to gauge his mental health?
Oh, I think there's a few. You can observe their behaviors. If you notice more nail biting, or if you notice more sleeplessness at night, if there's more night terrors or nightmares, you can start to ask the questions, is there something bothering you? Can we talk about it? Those kinds of things, because you do still have to ask permission for them to want to reveal to you what they're concerned about. And sometimes their concerns are as simple as, I had a granddaughter here the other day who was unable to go to her school, and they were in-person schooling because she was worried about her dog at home. The day before, the wind had blown down the dog enclosure, and she was afraid their dog would get out because it was a windy day. And so just addressing those questions when they offer them, but sometimes you have to do a little bit of work and ask those open-ended questions about, oh, you seem tired today. Didn't you sleep very well? Is there something bothering you? Would you like to have a little conversation about that? And take some quiet time to make them feel relaxed and comfortable so they can reveal to you what they're feeling. And sometimes it's really hard for them because they may be worried about you and the stressors that you're feeling.
Resilience is a state. Can you explain that more?
Yeah, so as I told you, when you build executive function skills, now that's more a trait. So you can build your executive function skills, which will help you in many, many situations. But every one of us is sometimes confronted by a stressful situation, and we just do not have the wherewithal to get the resources together because it may be so intense, and we may react more automatically. So you can have the skills for the most part, but occasionally, sometimes they don't work in some situations. And that's why we call resiliency is a state, not a trait, because it really is how you're responding to those stressful situations. So with resiliency, you're able to bounce back. And when you do not show that resiliency, that stress has caused and left an impression on you that can have negative consequences later on. So I hope that makes sense to you, but that's why when we talk about resiliency, we don't talk about it as a trait. It's really, how in this situation are you managing?
All right. Are the ways you recommend for improving executive function ways we can improve the trauma on the brain, or the effect of trauma on the brain?
I do believe so. As long as the people involved in I'm recommending play, and I'm recommending play through the lifespan. So my grandchildren are pretty stressed because of some of the online schooling. When they're not on online, we try to play. And sometimes it's a card game, and sometimes it's outside and running around. And it's brilliant to get them outside because that reduces their stress levels too. Just being outside helps you with your stress. When you're active outside, you get even better benefit. But those kinds of things where they feel safe, yes, you can play those games. You can enact that ability to develop relationship through laughter and fun. And that's one of the easiest ways to develop relationship.
Right, this is a long one, where regular, historical, intergenerational, insidious trauma compounded with civil war, major diseases like Ebola, divorce, custody, now COVID-19. In addition to exercise, medication, what else can be done to improve executive functioning? I am obviously...
Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
big one because it
yeah.
really sort of covers everything, the stressors in life. But I think self-care is one of the biggest things. Getting in a routine where you're paying attention to your diet, you're getting enough sleep. If you're not sleeping well, taking action so you can improve your sleep space or your sleep hygiene so you sleep better. Ensuring your children are getting enough sleep, because children these days tend not to be getting enough, and partly it's because they're online and not moving the way they typically do during the day. So I really believe that much of it can be mitigated by engaging in very healthy lifestyle situations. And if you need counseling for trauma, you have to seek it out, because it doesn't just go away on its own. You tend to carry that around with you as a burden. And that burden will eventually have health effects, physical and mental health effects, on the individual who has not resolved the trauma. So as a child, if you experienced many of those adversities, if you can make sense of why they happened, what was going on in your parents' life or the people around you that you experienced these things, when you can make sense of it, it no longer has a hold on you. So it's like coming back to that stress slide where I said it's really what you make of it. If you think stress will kill you, it likely will. But if you think it's your friend and you're having these stressful experiences so you can grow your knowledge and your adaptability for future situations, then your stress can be used in very positive ways. So it's a lot of is reframing, but really, really understanding that we have to take very good care of ourselves as well as protecting our children.
Right, lots of thank yous coming in. One final question here. Hold on. They said, what do you honestly feel are going to be the long-term effects on our children?
Well, there's so many questions that remain to be answered. They're talking now that 1 in 3 people who have had COVID will experience issues with their mental health and may actually have physical changes in their brain that will compromise some of their cognitive abilities. That's huge. 1 in 3, that's a ton. And a lot of people here in Canada have had it. So that's one of the elements. But then the elements of keeping away from those that we love, it's huge. And the stress that causes us is huge. So I am very fortunate that my parents are still alive. My dad is 95 this year and my mom is 90. And I try to check in with them every other day on FaceTime so we can see each other and have those engaged conversations, and they can know that I am well and I can know that they are well. I can see them there, and they seem to be, although very isolated, they're still thriving, and they're usually the hub of all activity. All of the relatives come to them and they're always the center of attention. So this has been particularly hard, but I have a sister who lives near them and she spends a lot more time with them now, and that is crucial as well. So we just have to be for the people that we have in our lives that we love and care about, we have to try to attend to their mental health and be aware when we see declines that maybe we need to step up our support. And also not be afraid to talk about the things that are affecting us. That genuine relationship, you can't replace it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gibb. Thank you for your time, your expertise, and we hope to have you back in the fall, maybe giving that father's role presentation for us again.
I'd love to. Thank you, Wendy.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Certificates will be sent out tomorrow. The recording looks like it's worked. Yay. And handouts will be sent out to everyone as well again tomorrow. Have a good evening. Good night.